Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a young mother who was found in her home under strange circumstances. From the very first hours of the investigation, the police discovered some disturbing and chilling clues. Detectives faced many unexpected and bizarre twists, but eventually, they managed to solve the case. Kathy Martin was born on October 25, 1959, in Houston, Texas. She grew up in a loving family and was very close to her sister. In high school, Kathy met a boy named Mike, and a few years later, they got married. The couple settled in a quiet suburb of Houston, and soon after their wedding, they had a daughter. 3 years later, Kathy became pregnant again, and in early 1987, they had a son. At that time, Kathy was 27 years old. After her second child was born, she spent all her time at home taking care of the kids. Mike worked at a small sign factory owned by Kathy's father, and the family had enough money to provide for their children. Kathy's parents also helped them financially, allowing her to dedicate all her time to the kids. On March 3, 1987, Kathy was at home with her children as usual, while Mike was at work. When his shift ended, he decided to meet up with some friends and headed to a bar. Mike called his wife from a payphone, but she didn't answer. This was unusual, as Kathy rarely had the opportunity to leave the house, even for a few minutes. Mike tried calling her several more times, but still got no response. Worried, he called their neighbor, Tim, and asked him to check on Kathy. Tim went to their house and knocked on the door, but no one answered. Looking through the living room window, he saw that the TV was on, so he kept knocking, but there was no response. Tim started to worry that something might have happened to Kathy. Instead of going back home to call Mike or the police, he got in his car and drove around town looking for patrol officers. After driving for a few minutes, he spotted a police car and explained the situation to the officers, asking them to check on Kathy. When the police arrived at the house and got no answer to their knock, they tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Entering the house, they immediately discovered Kathy's daughter on the living room sofa. She was unconscious, with visible signs of trauma, but still alive. The officers quickly called for an ambulance and continued to inspect the other rooms. In the bedroom, they found the younger child in his crib, safe and sound. But in another room, they were met with a horrifying sight. Kathy lay on the floor, covered in blood. She was naked, and the police immediately determined that she was dead. Her hands were also tied with a lamp cord. The paramedics took Kathy's daughter to the hospital and the investigators began examining the crime scene. Soon after, Kathy's father arrived at the house, but the police didn't reveal all the details of what had happened. Instead, they asked him to go to the hospital to be with his granddaughter when she woke up. He complied and, while he was waiting at the hospital, he learned about his daughter's death from a news report on the TV. Meanwhile, Mike arrived at the house and the police immediately noticed something strange. Besides the fact that he showed up quite late, there were several stains on his shirt that looked like blood. The police asked him to hand over his clothes and answer their questions. Meanwhile, investigators made some interesting discoveries. First, they found many bloodstains in the bathroom, indicating that the perpetrator had tried to clean up the crime scene. This suggested that the attacker had stayed in the house for some time instead of leaving immediately after the murder. Second, forensic experts found no signs of forced entry. All the windows and doors, except the front door, were locked. This indicated that Kathy either let the attacker in herself, or they had a key. The police also noted another detail: all of Kathy's clothes were neatly folded on the floor next to her body. This not only suggested the possibility of sexual assault, but also seemed strange that the attacker had folded her clothes so carefully. The detectives assumed that the assailant might have threatened to harm her children if she screamed or refused to comply with his demands. Kathy might have agreed to do whatever they say, only to be killed afterward. Meanwhile, medics were fighting for Kathy's daughter's life. They determined that she had been severely beaten, likely with bare hands. After several hours in the hospital, she fell into a coma and her chances of survival remained low. Medical experts examined Kathy's body and determined that she had received 16 stab wounds, primarily in the abdomen area. They also confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted and extracted biological material from the perpetrator. However, in those years, DNA analysis was not yet widely used in forensic science, so the experts could not extract a DNA profile from the semen. The best they could do was determine the perpetrator's blood type, so the biological material was sent to a lab. From the early hours of the investigation, the police began to focus their attention on the victim's husband. After noticing the suspicious stains on his shirt, they took his clothing for examination. Mike's behavior that evening also seemed strange. After work, he went out with friends, but instead of going home himself when he couldn't reach his wife, he asked a neighbor to check on her. Detectives had seen similar tactics before, where a husband committed the murder and created an alibi, such as going out with friends. Then, he would ask someone else to check on his wife to avoid being the one to find the body and divert suspicion from himself. Mike's involvement would also explain the lack of forced entry. Investigators began looking into whether he had the opportunity to commit the murder before meeting his friends. The detectives soon discovered something else. Mike had a criminal history. Right after high school, he was arrested for selling drugs to an undercover cop. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but served only 2 before being released on parole. Sometime later, he married Kathy. But, despite this, the police needed more evidence to charge him. They also started investigating the neighbor, Tim, whose behavior seemed odd. Instead of calling the police from his home, he drove around town looking for patrol officers. The detectives also examined Tim's car and made an interesting discovery. There were suspicious stains on the floor mats that looked like blood, so they were also sent to the lab. Investigators began to wonder whether Mike and Tim could have committed the crime together or if one of them acted alone. Meanwhile, medical experts finished their report and reached an intriguing conclusion. They determined that Kathy had died around 1 p.m., about 6 hours before she was found. This meant the detectives now had to investigate where the suspects were long before the evening and what they did after the murder. Mike and Tim both claimed they were at work, so the police began verifying their alibis. Meanwhile, 2 days after the murder, they received a call from the hospital. Kathy's daughter had suddenly come out of her coma. Her life was no longer in danger, and investigators went to see her, hoping she could shed light on what had happened, but they quickly encountered a problem. The girl, who was only 4 years old at the time, had almost completely lost her memory of that day. All she could recall was a man with light hair entering their house. Both her father and Tim had dark hair, but the detectives didn't rush to rule them out as suspects. They considered the possibility that the girl's memory could be inaccurate due to the severe trauma she had suffered. They consulted with psychologists and asked them to work with the girl, hoping she might remember more details about the perpetrator. The detectives soon received a call from the lab, and there was another unexpected twist. The experts examined the evidence from the 2 suspects and found that the stains on the neighbor's car mats were machine oil, and the stains on the husband's shirt were just paint. But that wasn't all. Numerous colleagues of Mike and Tim, who worked at different jobs, confirmed that they had been at their workplaces all day and hadn't left until the evening. This meant neither man had the opportunity to be at Kathy's house and commit the crime. Detectives asked them to undergo polygraph tests, and the results showed no signs of deception in both cases. The police, who had been almost certain of the involvement of at least one of the 2 suspects, found themselves back at square one. They began considering other possible suspects who were familiar with the victim and could have got inside her house without difficulty. Detectives spoke with Kathy's relatives and friends, asking who they thought might have committed the crime, and soon they discovered something unexpected. Many of them, without any hesitation, named the same person, Greg. Greg was Kathy's brother-in-law, and her loved ones revealed that she had often complained about his behavior. According to Kathy, Greg openly flirted with her and had repeatedly tried to persuade the woman to engage in intimacy with him. Kathy also mentioned that Greg often made inappropriate comments about her stomach and, as we know, most of the stab wounds were located in that area. The police also learned that Greg regularly used illegal substances and had a criminal history. Detectives began to focus on him and soon found their first potential lead. Forensic experts discovered a fingerprint in Kathy's house that matched Greg's, as well as a hair resembling his. However, there was a problem. Since Greg often visited Kathy and her husband, the fingerprint and hair could have been left there before the murder. Kathy's parents stated that they believed he was the murderer. Her mother also shared an interesting observation. While she was at the hospital with her granddaughter, Greg came to visit them in the middle of the night. As soon as the girl saw him, she looked at her grandmother and, judging by the expression on her face, she was very frightened. After Greg left, the grandmother asked if he was the man who had come to their house, but the girl said she still couldn't remember. After hearing all of this, the detectives called Greg in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder and said he was with a friend at the time, who also had a lengthy criminal history. In the middle of the interrogation, Greg said he needed to go to the parking lot to pay for additional time, but the man never returned to the station. His wife, Kathy's sister, recounted that on that day, Greg dropped her off at work around 10:30 in the morning and picked her up at 2:30 p.m. So, he had a 4-hour window that coincided with the time of the murder and provided him with the opportunity to kill Kathy. But, despite all this, the police lacked any substantial evidence that could prove his involvement. As a last resort, they decided to analyze the semen sample taken from the victim's body. But in those years, experts could only determine the blood type of its owner. It would also require a large sample and, after conducting such a test, there would be very little biological material left for further examination. Nevertheless, the detectives decided to conduct this test, and the blood type of the sample's owner from Kathy's body matched Greg's blood type. However, this result also didn't prove his guilt, so investigators couldn't arrest him. They continued to search for other evidence, but they couldn't prove Greg's involvement. Eventually, the case hit a dead end. Kathy's family was convinced that Greg was the killer, but they couldn't do anything about it. Shelley, Kathy's sister, refused to believe that her husband did it and continued to live with him. In the following years, detectives revisited the case from time to time, hoping to find any new leads. In 1998, 11 years after the murder, they requested DNA analysis on the remaining semen sample. However, they faced another setback. Experts could only extract a partial DNA profile, which, when compared to Greg's DNA sample, yielded inconclusive results. The analysis showed that Greg belonged to the 2% of the population who could match the partial profile. Unable to arrest him based on this result, detectives once again called Greg in for questioning, telling him that the semen from the victim's body matched his DNA. To their surprise, Greg changed his initial statement, claiming that he had a consensual relationship with Kathy and he indeed visited her on the day of the murder. But the man insisted that she was alive when he left. Detectives were obviously skeptical of Greg's sudden change in story. Such shifts are quite common in murder cases when suspects hear about DNA matches. Additionally, Kathy had complained about Greg's advances, feeling uncomfortable around him, so it was highly unlikely that she would have been in a secret relationship with him. But, despite their suspicions, detectives knew they couldn't secure a conviction without a full DNA match. The local prosecutors reviewed the case and confirmed that obtaining a guilty verdict would be practically impossible. And the case once again went cold for several years. In 2002, detectives reopened the investigation and sought the help of forensic scientist Catherine Long, who was conducting groundbreaking DNA research at the time. She and her colleagues wanted to determine if genetic material from a perpetrator's hands could remain on the victim's body after strangulation, and if it could be extracted for analysis. To test this, Catherine and her colleagues simulated strangulation by squeezing each other's necks, then took samples from their hands and the neck area. The results were quite intriguing. Even brief interaction left behind enough skin particles for DNA analysis. The detectives working on Kathy's case became interested in their experiment, despite the fact that the victim had not been strangled. Re-examining her body years later was also not possible. Instead, they began reviewing all available evidence to see if the perpetrator could have come into contact with any other items. Their attention soon turned to the lamp cord used to bind Kathy's hands. It was evident that only the killer could have tightened it, as the victim herself simply could not have done so. The detectives handed over the cord to Catherine, who, along with her colleagues, began examining it. They first noted an important detail. The cord had been stored in a paper bag, allowing air to circulate and preventing moisture buildup, which could have compromised biological samples. Experts took swabs from the entire length of the cord, including the areas where traces of Kathy's blood remained. Upon analysis, they discovered 2 DNA profiles. The first, belonging to the victim, was expected, but the second profile perfectly matched Greg's DNA sample. That meant the detectives finally obtained strong evidence that Greg was the person who bound Kathy's hands, and therefore, he was the killer. Shortly thereafter, 15 years after the murder, the man was finally arrested. During interrogation, he refused to admit his guilt, insisting that he had a romantic relationship with Kathy. The detectives, obviously, didn't believe him and, armed with the DNA evidence, decided to take the case to court. While awaiting trial, Greg was placed in prison. Sometime later, the detectives received an interesting call. His cellmate reached out to them, claiming that Greg had confessed to him. According to the cellmate, Greg boasted about assaulting and killing his wife's sister in detail. He said that on the day of the incident, Greg took illegal substances and went to Kathy's house. Once inside, he attempted to coerce her into an intimate encounter, but she resisted and demanded he leave. Greg then approached her daughter and inflicted a series of severe blows on her. After that, he told Kathy that if she didn't do everything he wanted, he would kill her son. Kathy, who had no other choice, agreed to protect her children. Greg tied her up, assaulted her, and killed her, inflicting numerous stab wounds. He then washed the blood off himself in the bathroom and changed into her husband's clothes to avoid getting blood in his own car. The detectives had no doubt about the truthfulness of the cellmate's words, as he couldn't have possibly guessed so many key details. Armed with the cellmate's testimony, the detectives confronted Greg, and this time, he finally confessed. He admitted to killing Kathy and repeated everything he had told his cellmate. In 2004, he pleaded guilty before the judge and received a 45-year prison sentence. However, he only served 4 years and died of liver cancer at the age of 56. Kathy's husband, Mike, didn't live to see the killer's arrest. He passed away at the age of 45. Kathy's children and parents thanked the detectives for bringing the case to a close, even though it took 15 years. All this time, they were almost certain that Greg was the murderer, and had to watch him continue to live with their second daughter, but couldn't do anything about it. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching. A couple set off on a short trip in their van, but they never returned home. When the police got involved, they found several disturbing clues, but the case remained unsolved. Soon after, the relatives of the missing couple started receiving mysterious letters about their fate, but this didn't help the investigators crack the case. It wasn't until several decades later that the truth was finally uncovered in an unexpected way. Tanya Vanquienborg was born on March 7, 1969, in Victoria, Canada. She had loving parents and an older brother she was very close to. From a young age, Tanya loved animals and even considered becoming a veterinarian someday. She also wanted to travel and explore the world. In high school, she went to Paris with her best friend, and that trip made her dream of traveling even stronger. Shortly before graduating high school, when she was 18, Tanya met a boy named Jay Cook. They went to the same school, but Jay was 2 years older. They met through a mutual friend after he had graduated, and soon they began dating. Even though Tanya wanted to be a veterinarian, she decided to take some time before going to college so she could travel. After finishing high school, she got a job at a cafe to save money for these plans, and she also worked as a dog walker. Jay also didn't go to college after high school. Instead, he helped his father with their small family business installing heating systems. In November 1987, Jay's father received an order, but the local suppliers didn't have one of the key parts in stock. The nearest place to buy it was Seattle, in Washington state. Jay's father decided it would be quicker and cheaper to get the part himself rather than order it for delivery. However, he was swamped with work and knew he couldn't fit the trip into his schedule. So, he asked his son to go to Seattle instead of him, and Jay agreed. Jay wanted to help his father with the business, but he was also excited for another reason. He decided to invite Tanya, knowing she would likely enjoy the trip. At that time, they had been dating for about 6 months, but their relationship wasn't very serious. Jay hoped that the trip would change that and bring them closer. As he expected, Tanya agreed right away. They planned to leave Victoria in the morning, reach Seattle by evening, and return the next day. Jay's father gave him his van and money to book a hotel room for the night. However, Jay and Tanya decided to save that money and just sleep in the van. Jay's father also gave him a check for $700 to buy the part and a few $100s for other expenses. Despite Seattle being relatively close to Victoria, the couple had to take 2 ferries, first to get into the US and then to cross the bay near Seattle. On the morning of November 18th, the couple got into the van and headed to the first ferry, which would take them to Port Angeles. Their parents expected them to return home the next day in the afternoon, but Tanya and Jay never showed up. Their families began to worry almost immediately, knowing the ferry schedule and realizing that if the couple had taken the ferry, they should have been home by now. However, the parents considered the possibility that Tanya and Jay might have simply decided to explore and enjoy the beautiful sights along the way, causing them to miss the ferry in Port Angeles. As time passed and there was still no sign of them, Tanya's parents called Jay's parents. By the afternoon, they were seriously concerned that something bad had happened. Despite their worries, the family held on to hope that the couple had just decided to extend their trip and continued to wait. Jay and Tanya did not return home by the end of the day, and the next morning their parents went to the police station to file a missing persons report. However, the local police decided there wasn't enough reason to conduct a full search. Tanya was 18 and Jay was 20. There was no direct evidence that they had been harmed or were victims of a crime. So, the police assumed the couple had just gone off on an adventure and told their parents to wait a few days. Naturally, they weren't satisfied with this response, but the officers refused to start the search. By that time, Tanya and Jay's parents were completely certain that they wouldn't have just decided to extend their trip for several days. Jay was supposed to do an important job for his father's business, and he had never been so irresponsible before. And if they had indeed decided to extend their trip, they would have at least called their families from a payphone, which were plentiful along their route. Eventually, Tanya's father decided to start the search on his own. First, he and Jay's parents found out that their children never picked up the part in Seattle. The supplier said he had waited for them for several hours, but no one showed up. Tanya's father drove along the route to Seattle, but this didn't yield any results. He found no trace of Tanya, Jay, or their van. Undeterred, he contacted a private company and rented a helicopter with a pilot to survey the area along their route from the air. However, this also led to nothing. Most of the area was covered with dense forests, making it difficult to spot anything. After that, Tanya's father made flyers with information about their disappearance and went to Seattle to post them on the streets. This went on for several days. The families of the missing couple did everything they could to find them, and the local police department finally started taking the case seriously. However, they still believed that Tanya and Jay were just spending time together somewhere and would eventually come home. As a result, they only contacted their colleagues in Seattle, providing a description of the van and information about Tanya and Jay, asking to notify them if anyone spotted them. On November 24th, 5 days after the disappearance, a man went for a walk in the woods near a small town about 90 miles north of Seattle. While walking along the road near an embankment leading into the forest, he noticed something unusual under a tree below. When he took a closer look, he realized it was a human body and immediately called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and discovered the body of a young woman. Her clothes were partially missing, hands were tied, and there was a gunshot wound on her head. Investigators quickly determined that the victim had been killed elsewhere, as there was almost no blood near the body. There was no ID on the victim, so the police checked the list of missing women in the area. They quickly concluded that the victim matched the description of Tanya Vanquienborg and contacted her father. He went to the morgue and confirmed that the deceased was indeed his daughter. Detectives began their investigation, trying to establish all the details of what had happened. They learned that Tanya had been traveling with Jay, whose whereabouts were still unknown. Jay's van was also missing, leading investigators to consider his possible involvement. Jay's family refused to believe he could have done something like this. They insisted that he had never shown signs of aggression and that he loved Tanya. He also did not own a firearm and would not have been able to purchase one easily. While the police were trying to locate him, they got another call. A bartender from a town called Bellingham, about 18 miles from where the body was found, went outside and saw a wallet and keys on the ground. When he opened the wallet, he found an ID with the name Tanya Vanquienborg. At first, he didn't call the police. Instead, he took everything back to the bar, thinking the owner might return for them. But, after seeing a news report about Tanya's murder on TV, he immediately called 911. Detectives searched the area around the bar and found several plastic zip ties identical to those used to bind Tanya's hands under the back porch. They also discovered rubber gloves and a half-empty box of bullets. But that wasn't all. One of the officers noticed a van parked nearby, and the police quickly determined that it was the same vehicle Tanya and Jay had traveled in. Inside the van, there was utter chaos. Everything was scattered and broken, but investigators managed to find several important clues. There were numerous receipts that could help reconstruct Tanya and Jay's route, as well as a ferry ticket. This indicated that the couple had indeed made it to Seattle and something horrible happened to them there. Detectives also noticed that Tanya's camera, which she had taken on the trip, was missing from the van. Since it wasn't found near her body either, they speculated that the killer might have taken it. The interior of the van was covered in blood. Forensic experts collected these samples and sent them to the lab, hoping that this evidence would bring them closer to solving the case. At that time, DNA analysis was just starting to be used in criminology, but it had already helped solve several cases. The lab in Seattle conducted the analysis and found 3 blood samples: Tanya's, Jay's, and an unknown man's. Since the FBI's DNA database did not exist yet, it was impossible to identify the third person without a direct comparison. Nevertheless, detectives realized that Jay was likely not involved in the murder and stopped considering him as the main suspect. They now faced other questions. Was he still alive? And where was he? Unfortunately, it didn't take long to find the answer. On November 26th, a group of friends went hunting just a few miles from Seattle. While walking near a bridge over a small river, they saw a human body in the bushes and reported it to the police. Investigators quickly identified the deceased as Jay Cook. His body showed numerous bruises and the cause of death appeared to be strangulation. Given the brutality of this crime, detectives even considered that the perpetrator might have known Jay and had some personal motives. They also theorized that Jay had been killed first, since his body was found closer to Seattle. The perpetrator then drove Tanya in the van almost to the Canadian border, killed her, and left her body in a wooded area. Medical experts also found traces of semen on her body, and DNA analysis revealed that it belonged to the same man whose blood was found in the van. However, his identity remained unknown. At the same time, investigators were trying to reconstruct the couple's route, and the receipts found in the van helped them establish an approximate timeline. After Tanya and Jay took the ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles, they stopped at a store to buy some food. Then, they headed toward Seattle, but Jay apparently missed the turn for the shortest route. This was supported by a receipt from a store in the small town of Hoodsport and the testimony of the store clerk, who saw a young couple matching their description and remembered they asked for directions to the ferry crossing. The clerk also shared an interesting observation. She thought that a man in a brown raincoat was following the couple. He entered the store shortly after them and left right after they did, but she didn't see where the man went next. The next receipt showed detectives that Tanya and Jay had visited a store in the small town of Allen. After that, they reached the ferry near Seattle and bought a ticket. Several witnesses saw them near this location, but detectives couldn't track their movements beyond that point. Investigators began checking various individuals in Seattle who had previous convictions for violent crimes, trying to find suspects, but these efforts yielded no results. Despite having the killer's DNA, the police had no idea how to identify the perpetrator. They suspected this person had committed serious crimes before, as it was hard to believe an amateur could pull off such an elaborate crime. It seemed likely he had followed the couple for a while and managed to abduct them once they reached Seattle. Investigators thought he might have gained their trust by asking for a ride and at some point used a gun to force them to comply with his demands. They also thought that the killer had deliberately left Tanya's belongings and the rubber gloves in a visible place to taunt the police. Perhaps the killer was trying to say that it was useless to search for his fingerprints since he wore gloves and they wouldn't be able to catch him. It's worth mentioning that forensic experts found several fingerprints on the van that did not belong to Tanya or Jay. However, the police doubted they belonged to the killer, given that he likely wore gloves. These prints were not in any databases, so they did not bring investigators any closer to catching the perpetrator. For the next few weeks, detectives continued to search for new leads or witnesses and checked various suspects, but none of these efforts yielded results. This continued until December, about a month after the murders, when something unexpected happened. Tanya and Jay's family started receiving letters and postcards from someone claiming to be the killer. In these messages, the sender confessed to the crimes, mocked the victims' families, and said the police would never catch him. Investigators tried to trace the sender, but this was extremely difficult in those days. All they could determine was which cities the letters were sent from, but this information did not help identify the perpetrator. The letters continued to arrive on a regular basis, often during holidays, which investigators believed was the sender's way of causing the families even more pain. Police also found that the letters were sent from different cities and states, indicating that the sender traveled around the country. However, they weren't entirely sure that the sender was the killer. In high-profile cases, it's not uncommon for people to torment the victims' families with fake letters claiming to be from the perpetrator. Unfortunately, fake letters from supposed perpetrators are a common thing. Since then, there was no significant progress in the case for many years. Detectives continued to investigate potential suspects and did not rule out the involvement of a serial killer. This theory was supported by the fact that two other couples had been abducted in the same part of the state in recent years, although the police found the connection between these cases tenuous. In the following years, investigators caught several serial killers operating in the area, but none were linked to the murders of Tanya and Jay. In 2003, the case was reopened and detectives entered the perpetrator's DNA sample into the FBI database, but no matches were found. Despite this, they continued to believe that the perpetrator must have had a lengthy criminal history, but either had not been caught by the police or had been arrested before DNA sampling became mandatory. In 2010, something else happened. This case was featured on a popular national TV program, resulting in numerous fresh tips. One caller suggested that he might know the identity of the person who sent the letters to the victims' families. This lead pointed to a 78-year-old man from Seattle, and the police began investigating him. It turned out that this man had traveled extensively around the country during those years, and the location of his trips matched the cities from which the letters were sent. Detectives concluded that he was indeed the author of these letters but had no connection to the actual murders. This individual clearly suffered from severe mental health issues, and his DNA did not match the blood and semen samples from the crime scenes. This confirmed that the letters were written not by the real perpetrator but by a completely unrelated person. The case remained cold for several more years. In 2018, detectives learned about Parabon, a company offering to create composite sketches of individuals based on their DNA samples. Given the lack of any other leads, investigators decided to try this method. Parabon experts created estimated sketches of the killer at different ages, and the police distributed these images to the media, hoping someone might recognize the man. However, it led nowhere. Despite this, the investigators refused to give up and decided to try another method, genetic genealogy. Parabon experts uploaded the killer's DNA sample to public databases and began searching for any distant relatives of the perpetrator. Soon, they identified a possible second cousin of the killer and started tracing her family tree. They were searching for a man who lived in Seattle or its vicinity in 1987 and matched all the criteria, including age. With the help of his cousin, they eventually identified their suspect, a 55-year-old man named William Talbot. He lived in a Seattle suburb and worked as a truck driver. Before they could arrest him, police needed to confirm that the killer's DNA matched his. They surveilled William for a couple of days and eventually retrieved a coffee cup he had discarded. The saliva sample from the cup provided a DNA profile that was a perfect match. In mid-May 2018, 30 years after the murders, investigators finally arrested William. He denied any involvement and the case went to court. The trial began in 2019 and the defense attorneys tried to challenge the primary evidence, the DNA. They argued that the semen on Tanya's body could have resulted from consensual intercourse. They also pointed out that the prosecution had no other evidence directly linking William to Jay's murder. However, the prosecutor had a strong counterargument. As we remember, back in 1987, experts found fingerprints on the van that did not match Tanya or Jay, nor did they match anyone in the database at the time. Now, experts compared these fingerprints to Talbot's, and they were a match. Another crucial piece of evidence came from Talbot's friend. He testified that he saw a brown van outside Talbot's house in 1987, which clearly didn't belong to him. This suggested that William might have driven the van to his house, although it was unclear whether this was before or after the murders. William also lived only a few miles from where Jay's body was found, indicating he was familiar with the area. None of William's relatives attended the trial, but they did share quite a bit with the investigators. They described William as always being very aggressive, and other family members were genuinely afraid of him. Because of this, most had cut off contact with him after he had moved out. When they learned about the charges against him, none were surprised that William could have committed such crimes. The prosecution's theory was that William had asked Tanya and Jay for a ride to Seattle under some pretext. Once they arrived in the city at night, he used a gun to force them to drive to a remote area. He then killed them at different locations, discarded Tanya's belongings and the van in another town, and remained off the police radar for the next 30 years. Without a confession, it was impossible to establish more details, but with such substantial evidence, no one doubted William's guilt. The trial ended in June 2019, and William was found guilty of the double murder. He received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Notably, this was the first case where genetic genealogy led to a conviction. However, an unexpected problem arose after the trial. Talbot's lawyers appealed the conviction, arguing that the jury had been biased against the defendant, which they claimed violated his constitutional rights and made the jurors unfit to serve. This led to a judge overturning the conviction in 2021, granting William the right to a retrial. However, in 2022, a higher court reversed this decision, upholding the original conviction. As for William's potential involvement in other crimes, there is still no clarity. He had previous convictions for minor and medium offenses, but had never been charged with murder. Investigators still believe William may be linked to other unsolved cases, because the murder of Tanya and Jay did not seem like the work of an amateur. The way he executed the crime and evaded justice for decades indicated he might have killed before. But we may never learn the truth. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A mother of 2 vanished under strange circumstances, leaving behind a string of unsettling messages to her family. Police jumped on the case right away, trying to make sense of a web of contradictions. But not even the most seasoned detectives could have imagined where this investigation would lead. What began as a missing persons case soon spiraled into a story that would shock the entire country. Katie Kenyon was born in 1983 in the small British town of Burnley. She had 2 sisters, older and younger, and the 3 of them were incredibly close. Even as a kid, Katie stood out for her kindness and generosity. She was the type of person who would drop everything to help someone in need. Later in life, she got married and had 2 kids, a son and a daughter. But eventually, her husband left the family. He still saw the kids from time to time, but from that point on, Katie was raising them on her own, which wasn't easy. She worked as a social care worker, and her paycheck barely covered the basics. But no matter how hard things got, Katie did everything she could to make sure her children had what they needed. On the morning of April 22, 2022, 33-year-old Katie went about her usual routine, got her kids ready, and sent them off to school. But just a few hours later, around noon, her mom got a text from her that felt totally off. Katie said she needed some time away to clear her head and would be gone for a while. Her mom tried calling right away, but the call went straight to voicemail. And that's when the panic really started to set in. She knew Katie had been struggling with anxiety for years, mostly from all the stress in her life. But the idea that she'd just walk away from everything, especially her kids, that just didn't add up. Her mom got in touch with Katie's sisters, and none of them believed the message either. They rushed over to her house and noticed that her car was gone. Using a spare key, they let themselves inside and found all of Katie's belongings right where she'd left them, except for her phone and handbag. It just didn't add up. The idea that Katie had taken off somewhere, leaving behind almost everything she owned, felt completely wrong. Something was off. A little while later, Katie's kids came home from school, and they had something to say too. They'd both received strange messages from their mom. In the text, she said she needed to get help so she could be a better mother and asked them to contact their dad so he could look after them while she was away. As soon as they read the messages, Katie's mom and sisters started seriously doubting that she'd written them. First of all, the tone didn't sound like her at all. But more importantly, there was something else that really stood out. In both messages, the word, while, was misspelled, and that just didn't make sense because Katie never made mistakes like that. Then, her son mentioned something else. He said a man named Andrew Burfield had messaged him on social media. Andrew was Katie's ex, someone she'd dated for several years. In the message, he said Katie had checked herself into a clinic and asked him to take care of her dog until she got back. Katie's mom and sisters thought the whole thing was pretty strange. Sure, they'd known she'd dated Andy for a long time, but it had never been a smooth relationship. The two of them were on and off constantly. As far as her family knew, they weren't even together anymore. So it didn't make much sense that Katie would fill him in on her plans, but not say a word to her own mother or kids. In the messages she'd sent her son and daughter, Katie had also mentioned Andy. She said that if their dad couldn't look after them, Andy would step in. One of Katie's sisters eventually got a hold of his number and gave him a call. Andy told her he hadn't seen Katie since the day before, since he'd been at work all morning. He said that around 2 p.m., she texted him saying she was going to drop her car off at his place and that she was leaving the keys and her bank card in his mailbox. Katie had owed Andy a large sum of money, about £6,000, for anxiety treatment he'd helped her pay for in the past. So, according to him, this was her way of paying him back. In her next message, Katie said she was heading back to a clinic because she just couldn't handle the anxiety anymore. Andy said nothing about it struck him as odd, so he didn't think much of it. Still, Katie's sister wasn't buying Andy's story. Not one bit. So, she and her boyfriend decided to drive over to his place and see for themselves. The moment they pulled up, she spotted Katie's car parked outside. Inside, she could see Katie's purse and other personal belongings, which only made her more suspicious. She knocked on Andy's door, hoping to talk to him face to face, but he refused to open it and told them to leave. The whole thing felt incredibly off. Katie's sister couldn't wrap her head around why Andy didn't seem the slightest bit worried, or why he was being so uncooperative. Her boyfriend ended up threatening to kick the door down if he didn't let them in, but Andy just called the police instead. A few minutes later, officers arrived and spoke with Katie's sister first. She laid everything out, how the family was worried sick, how they didn't believe for a second that Katie would just vanish without saying a word to anyone. She also pointed out her sister's car still parked there with her stuff inside. After that, the police knocked on Andy's door. He gave them the same story he told over the phone, that he'd been at work when Katie supposedly dropped off her car, keys, and bank card, and said she was going to check herself into a clinic. He even let them search his house and his van, and they didn't find anything suspicious. So, the police left, but they did open a missing persons case. Just to cover all bases, they called around to a bunch of clinics, hoping maybe Katie really had checked herself in somewhere, but not a single one had seen her. The next morning, police began piecing together a timeline of Katie's disappearance. And naturally, all eyes were on Andy's house, since that's where her car had been found. Detectives learned there was a surveillance camera nearby, so they pulled the footage from the previous couple of days. On April 21st, the day before Katie went missing, she was seen pulling up to Andy's house. The footage showed her getting into his van, kissing him and smiling. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the next morning, at 9:20 a.m., things took a very different turn. That was the day Andy told police he'd been at work when Katie supposedly dropped off her car. But the footage said otherwise. It clearly showed Katie arriving at his house, getting out of her car, and climbing into the passenger seat of Andy's van. And right there behind the wheel was Andy himself. Police immediately checked traffic cameras along the direction the van had gone and eventually spotted it again. This time, the van stopped at a McDonald's, then headed out toward the highway. The final footage showed Andy turning onto a rural back road, leading into a wooded area. After that, the van disappeared from view for nearly an hour. But then it popped up again, heading back the way it came. This time, though, there was only one person in the vehicle. So now, a much darker picture was starting to form. Based on the footage, it looked like Andy had driven Katie out to a wooded area and then left without her. After reviewing the surveillance videos, police pulled location data from Katie's phone on the day she went missing. The records showed that her phone disconnected from the tower near her house early that morning, then reconnected near Andy's home. From there, the phone's path followed the exact route the van had taken. But soon enough, things stopped lining up. According to the location data, Katie's phone was still in the van as it headed back towards Andy's place. The problem was, Katie was no longer in the van. And then came the final piece. Investigators checked the time those strange messages were sent to Katie's mom and kids. And by that point, Andy had already returned home alone. But location data clearly showed that those texts were sent from his house. Given that all the evidence directly contradicted Andy's version of events, police decided to head back to his house. And the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. The place was boiling hot. Turns out, Andy had fired up the wood-burning stove, despite the weather being pretty mild outside. Right away, detectives suspected he might have been trying to destroy some evidence. But by the time they got there, all that was left in the stove was ash. Even so, they arrested Andy and brought him in for questioning. Surprisingly, he didn't seem nervous at all. In fact, he looked completely relaxed and stuck to his original story, claiming Katie had probably checked herself into a clinic to deal with her anxiety. When detectives started pressing for more answers, he shut down completely and said he wouldn't talk without a lawyer. So, once again, they were left with nothing. After the interrogation, police decided to launch a large-scale search operation in the forest where Katie's phone had last pinged, right before Andy was seen driving back alone. But covering that area wasn't an easy task. They were looking at roughly 25 miles of rugged terrain. Still, they pulled in dozens of officers, requested backup from other agencies, and headed out into the woods. Soon, they had helicopters with thermal imaging, drones, specialized equipment, and even a team of divers. Volunteers joined too, and the search quickly became one of the biggest operations their town had ever seen. But even with all that manpower, it still wasn't enough to cover such a huge area. Then, out of nowhere, police got a tip. Someone had seen Andy's van parked in a specific part of the forest. That changed everything. Now that they had a likely spot, they were able to narrow the search down to a 5-mile radius. As the search teams combed through the forest, detectives brought Andy in for another round of questioning. This time, they laid out the surveillance footage and other evidence they'd gathered. And now, faced with the facts, Andy changed his story. He admitted that he and Katie had driven out to the woods, but what he said next left investigators baffled. According to Andy, the two of them went there to have a picnic. He claimed Katie had a habit of writing down her thoughts in a journal and then burning the pages as a way to let go of things that were bothering her. He insisted that morning had been no different. They had a picnic, lit a small fire, she burned a few pages, and then, according to him, he drove home. As for what happened to Katie after that, he said he had no idea. Of course, detectives didn't buy Andy's story. But the problem was, they still didn't have any solid leads. The search teams had come up empty, and with no trace of Katie in the woods, investigators shifted their focus to her relationship with Andy. According to her family, Katie had met him 3 years earlier. He had 2 kids from a previous marriage, worked in construction, and at first, he seemed like a reliable, stable guy. But it didn't take long for her loved ones to notice cracks in the relationship. Andy had a habit of trying to control Katie, telling her how to act, how to talk, even how to think. He also constantly brought up her anxiety, using it as a way to dismiss anything she said or did that he didn't like. And over time, that pressure only made her anxiety worse. Eventually, Andy offered to pay for her treatment, and Katie agreed. But as time went on, things just kept getting worse. The fights became more frequent, more intense, and eventually the relationship fell apart. For Katie, breaking up felt like a weight off her shoulders. But for Andy, it was something he just couldn't accept. Not long after they split, Katie discovered someone had slashed the tires on her car. She was certain it was Andy, but she never reported it to the police. A few months before Katie went missing, she got a letter from the court saying she owed Andy £4,000, the amount he'd spent on her treatment. Katie was already struggling to cover basic expenses for her and her kids, and she had no idea how she'd come up with that kind of money. Over time, late fees piled on, and the debt grew to £6,000. The whole situation sent her anxiety through the roof. She was terrified she'd lose her home, and with it, the only stable place her kids had. But more than anything, she was afraid of Andy. In one message to her mom, Katie said she was scared of him and genuinely believed he might hurt her. She even told her sister, "If anything ever happens to me, look at Andy first." Just a month before she disappeared, Andy reached out to her. He told her he regretted ever taking her to court. He promised to drop the case and even said he'd pay all the extra fees that had built up since the ruling. Andy apologized for his anger, told her he wanted to change, and eventually, Katie forgave him. Despite everything, they got back together. Still, the detectives found something even more disturbing. Just one day after Andy promised to fix everything with the court, he actually called the debt collectors and told them to go harder on Katie. He wanted them to push her even more. Investigators believe this was all part of his plan to increase the pressure on her, making her even more dependent on him. Katie, of course, had no idea this was happening because Andy kept telling her he was working on canceling the whole thing. A few weeks later, he called the debt collectors again, this time claiming that Katie had shown up at his house and attacked him. Once again, he pushed them to go after her for the money as quickly as possible. When they got in touch with Katie, she freaked out. But Andy brushed it off, telling her she was just being dramatic and there was no reason to panic. He said he was still working on getting the court ruling overturned, but that it was complicated and would take time. And then, just like before, he went right back to telling her she needed help, that something was wrong with her. This gave detectives an even darker picture of what they were dealing with. All the evidence pointed to one thing: Andy was a skilled manipulator and a compulsive liar who would do anything to get what he wanted. And soon, the detectives got even more confirmation of that theory. People who knew him said the same thing. They told investigators that Andy had a way of getting into people's heads and controlling them, something he'd been doing for years, even with those closest to him. But, even with all that, police still had no clue where Katie was. The search dragged on day after day, with no trace of her. But then, finally, investigators caught a break. A local man came forward with a strange story. He said that the morning after Katie went missing, Andy randomly showed up at his house. They didn't know each other, but Andy walked up to him and asked him a weird question. "Do you know when your bins were last emptied?" That immediately raised red flags. Officers rushed over and found that the trash bins outside hadn't been picked up in several days. They started digging through the garbage, and inside one of the bags, they found something chilling. It was stained with blood, and inside were Katie's sandals. A DNA test confirmed that the blood was hers. At that point, detectives were sure of one thing: Katie was gone, and Andy was officially charged with her murder. But there was still one huge problem: they had no idea where her body was. Soon after Andy was formally charged with murder, he told detectives he wanted to talk. And, just like before, he changed his story yet again. This time, Andy said he and Katie had gone out to the woods that morning for a picnic. While they were sitting by the fire, Katie spotted a hatchet he'd used to chop some wood. And, according to him, she jokingly dared him to throw it and try to hit a soda can she was holding a few feet away. Andy said he took her up on it, but as he threw the hatchet, Katie suddenly leaned forward, and it struck her in the back of the head. Of course, detectives didn't buy a word of it, but this time, Andy at least admitted where her body was. He said that when Katie collapsed and died, he panicked. There was no cell service in that part of the forest, and according to him, he didn't have the strength to carry her back to the van. So instead, he decided to bury her right there, to keep animals from getting to her body. He said he dug a shallow grave, placed Katie's body inside, and covered it with leaves and branches. Then he marked the spot by tying a plastic bag to a stick, planning to come back later. According to Andy, his plan was to go home, say goodbye to his kids, settle everything, and then just be gone. He also admitted to burning Katie's phone along with some of her other belongings in his fireplace. After that, he scooped up the charred remains and dumped them in a trash bin somewhere around town. After speaking with Andy, police headed back to his house, hoping to uncover something new. This time, forensic experts did manage to find traces of blood inside his washing machine, which belonged to Katie. Meanwhile, the search for Katie's body continued. Investigators focused on locating the stick with the plastic bag Andy claimed he'd used to mark the burial site. But even with that clue, search teams still couldn't find the exact spot. While the search was still underway, detectives uncovered something else. After digging into Andy's online activity, they found that he'd been talking to a number of women on various dating sites, flirting with pretty much anyone who'd respond. He'd even been seeing at least one woman in person. According to their conversations, Andy had told her he owned multiple properties across the country. They were even talking about moving to Scotland together and buying a house. But that wasn't even the most interesting part. As they kept going through his phone, investigators discovered something that changed everything. Based on GPS data, the day before Katie vanished, Andy had stopped by his parents' house, then turned off his phone for about an hour and a half. During that time, his van was caught on several surveillance cameras, heading straight toward the woods. After talking to Andy's parents, police found out that the morning before Katie went missing, he'd borrowed a shovel. That's when it hit them. Andy had probably gone out to the woods that day to dig her grave ahead of time. The next day, after killing Katie and using her phone to message her kids and family, Andy also texted his other girlfriend using his own phone. He told her something had come up with his kids and that he'd have to cancel their date. But that wasn't all. In the Notes app on his phone, investigators found something even more disturbing: drafts of the exact same messages he'd sent to Katie's children and mother. Digital forensics showed that he'd been editing those drafts over the course of several weeks, tweaking them repeatedly, trying to match Katie's writing style so no one would suspect a thing. And most telling of all was the fact that the word, while, was misspelled in the exact same way it appeared in the final messages. It's also worth noting that the note had been created over a month before the murder, and that proved one thing beyond all doubt: Andy didn't just snap. He'd been planning this for weeks, maybe even longer, carefully laying the groundwork for something he knew he was going to do. When police confronted Andy with the evidence that he'd been in the woods the day before the murder, he claimed he had just gone there to walk his dog, not to dig a grave. Soon, search teams finally found the stick with the plastic bag Andy had mentioned, but there was no grave anywhere nearby. They scoured the area inch by inch, but came up empty. So, detectives made a decision. They brought Andy out to the woods and asked him to show them exactly where he'd buried Katie. Once they got there, Andy pointed to a specific patch of ground, and what shocked everyone was that search teams had already been through that exact spot multiple times, but no one had even considered that a grave could be hidden there. The ground looked completely untouched, smooth, and totally natural. No signs of digging, no shifted soil, nothing out of place. It had been concealed so well, officers later admitted there was no way they would have ever found it without Andy's help. As soon as the forensic team began digging, they found Katie, right where Andy had said she'd be. But what they uncovered next was something no one expected. Somehow, Andy had managed to bury her beneath a web of tree roots that were growing deep underground. Later, a geology expert explained just how complex that grave actually was. According to him, it would have taken hours to dig something like that. There was no way Andy could have done it in one go, so he'd clearly come back more than once. The expert also pointed out that Andy had separated the soil by layers, then buried them back in the correct order, which is exactly why the grave looked so untouched. That level of planning was chilling. Once Katie's body was recovered, it was handed over to forensic examiners. And right away, Andy's story about the Coke can and the axe throw completely fell apart. Katie had died from blows to the head with a hatchet, but not just one or two. She'd been struck 12 times. By that point, there was no doubt in the detectives' minds. This wasn't an accident. This was cold, calculated, and premeditated murder. With all of that, the prosecution began preparing for trial. The evidence against Andy was overwhelming, more than enough to secure a conviction. But one thing remained unclear: the motive. Investigators believed Andy was fueled by bitterness and resentment. Katie had broken up with him months earlier, and it looked like his ego just couldn't handle the rejection. That bruised pride, they believed, turned into hatred and ultimately led him to kill her. The trial began in November 2022, and at first, Andy pleaded not guilty. But just 3 days in, he suddenly changed course. Out of nowhere, he reversed his plea and admitted to the murder. Unfortunately for Katie's family, he didn't offer any new details, just accepted responsibility. But it was still enough, and in the end, the court sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 32 years, calling him a deeply dangerous individual. And so, the case was officially closed. But the story surrounding Andy still leaves questions. Given that he was dating multiple women at once and constantly pursuing others through dating apps, it's hard to shake the feeling that Katie may not have been the only one. Everything about him pointed to a man who craved control, who seemed to enjoy manipulating and hurting the women around him. And there's every reason to believe that Katie might not have been the first. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A woman attended a Christmas party with her daughter, but in the midst of the celebration, the girl mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Despite an extensive search by hundreds of volunteers, police, and even the FBI, no sign of her was found. As the investigation unfolded, detectives uncovered troubling clues that painted a dark and complex picture. In the end, they did uncover a shocking truth, but it was far from what anyone had anticipated. Melissa Brannon was born on April 12, 1984, in Texas. Not long after, her parents divorced and her mom decided to move to a small town called Lorton, Virginia. It was a quiet, peaceful place, popular among families with kids. Melissa's mom, Tammy, got a job as an accountant at a local company and rented an apartment in a residential complex on the outskirts of town. The complex was made up of small apartment buildings, and one of the best things about it was all the regular events and activities organized for the residents and their kids. These events happen every Friday and on holidays, giving everyone a chance to get to know each other, creating a close-knit, friendly community. Melissa liked the place. She was 5 years old when they moved, and she spent most of her time playing outside with the other kids. She also loved taking part in the events because there were always plenty of fun and delicious food. On December 3rd, the complex held a Christmas event in a separate building with several halls. About 200 residents attended, enjoying dinner in small groups while their kids ran around having fun. Around 10 p.m., Tammy decided it was time to go home. She called for Melissa and asked her to grab their jackets while she said goodbye to some friends. Melissa also asked if she could take some chips home, and her mom agreed. A few minutes later, when Tammy had finished her goodbyes, she noticed Melissa still hadn't returned. She began checking every hall and even peeked into the hallway, but there was no sign of her daughter. Worried, she started asking the other guests if they'd seen Melissa, but no one had. With each passing minute, Tammy's concern grew, and soon word spread among the neighbors that Melissa had gone missing. Many people began helping Tammy search. They looked through the building, checked outside, but Melissa was nowhere to be found. Finally, Tammy decided to call the police, and within minutes, officers arrived at the complex. They immediately joined the search, combing through the entire area. By that time, even more neighbors had heard about Melissa's disappearance, and over 300 volunteers were now helping look for her. The police initially thought that Melissa might have wandered outside and gotten lost, but as the search went on, this theory seemed less and less likely. It was cold and dark outside, making it unlikely that a young girl could have gone far. Plus, Melissa was familiar with the complex, even at her age, so the officers doubted she would have wandered off in a completely different direction. What made the situation even more difficult was the fact that there was a large forest right behind the complex, so it was possible that Melissa had somehow ended up there and gotten lost. The search of the building where the Christmas event was held didn't yield many results. Melissa's jacket was missing, but there were no other clues to explain her disappearance. The only thing that stood out to the police was an open window in the boiler room. They considered the possibility that she might have climbed out through it, but even that didn't seem very likely. After failing to find Melissa, the police began interviewing everyone who had attended the event. None of the neighbors recalled seeing her leave the building or anyone taking her outside. Melissa's mom didn't notice anything strange that evening either. The officers also asked if she'd had any issues with anyone in the complex or noticed anything odd, but Tammy assured them that she got along well with everyone and there had never been any signs of trouble. The police considered the possibility that Melissa's father could have taken her, as this is a common scenario in such cases, but they were able to confirm that he was in Texas and couldn't have been in another state at the time. With no other leads, the police decided to expand their search. Some officers headed into the forest behind the complex, while others continued checking the remaining buildings. Even though it was late into the night, hundreds of residents stayed out to help the police search for the missing girl. Unfortunately, the search led to nothing. There were no signs of Melissa in the forest or any of the numerous buildings in the complex. At that point, the police sent the volunteers home and decided to go door to door, speaking to every resident. Around 400 people lived there, and that night, officers talked to each one of them. No one had any idea where Melissa could have gone, so investigators asked them to think back on anything strange or suspicious that had happened around the complex, even if it didn't seem related to her disappearance. That's when they got their first interesting lead. Several women mentioned that Caleb Hughes, one of the complex's maintenance workers, had been acting inappropriately that night. He tried to flirt with them and made some very lewd comments, even though most of them were with their husbands. Hughes, who was 23 at the time, had also raised red flags with parents. Many of them noticed that he seemed to be paying an unusual amount of attention to their children during the evening. Hearing all these complaints, the police went back to Tammy and asked if she had noticed anything odd about Hughes. Tammy recalled that during the event, he had approached her several times to strike up a conversation about her daughter. At one point, he even offered to take Melissa to the restroom so Tammy wouldn't have to leave the party. All of this seemed suspicious to the investigators, so they decided to talk to Hughes. However, he was nowhere to be found, so the officers headed to his home. Hughes lived just a few miles from the complex, but when the police knocked on his door, he wasn't there either. Instead, his wife answered and told them that he hadn't come home that evening. The police left, but returned a few hours later. By then, Hughes was back and said he had arrived home around 12:30 a.m. The officers quickly realized that Hughes had left the complex about 2.5 hours before returning home, which was odd since his commute should only have taken about 10 minutes. Hughes claimed that he had taken a longer route to stop at a store for a pack of beer, but the police were skeptical of his story. First, a quick stop still wouldn't account for nearly 3 hours. And second, there was a state law prohibiting alcohol sales after midnight. On top of that, Hughes couldn't provide a receipt for his purchase. The situation looked pretty suspicious, so the police asked Hughes to hand over the clothes he had worn to work that day. This is when things got even stranger. Hughes said that he had thrown his clothes into the washing machine as soon as he got home. Despite this, the officers convinced him to give them the clothing. To their surprise, they found that he had also washed his shoes, but that wasn't all. Parts of the soles had been cut off, and along with the clothes, there was a large knife sheath and a leather belt in the washing. Machine. The police asked where the knife was, but Hughes claimed he couldn't remember. With all of this suspicious behavior, the investigators began to seriously suspect Hughes' involvement in Melissa's disappearance. They took his clothes and brought them to the lab. When forensic experts applied luminol to his shoes, the chemical revealed traces of blood on them. But because he had already washed it, there wasn't enough left for a proper DNA sample, making it impossible to analyze. Detectives returned to Hughes' home and brought him in for questioning. During the long hours of interrogation, Hughes stuck to his story despite all the inconsistencies and suspicious evidence. He also claimed that he had no idea who Melissa was, what she looked like, or what had happened to her. The police knew he was lying since multiple witnesses, including Tammy, had seen him playing with Melissa and other children that evening. But when the detectives confronted him with that and said, "We know you're lying," Hughes calmly responded, "Prove it." Despite the detectives' suspicions, they didn't have enough solid evidence to arrest him, so Hughes was released. The next day, investigators ramped up the search operation, hoping to find either Melissa or more clues. That morning, they also decided to speak with Hughes' wife without him present, and she shared an interesting observation. Apparently, their relationship had been troubled and she didn't trust him. Before Hughes left for the Christmas event, she checked the mileage on his car and remembered the reading. After he returned, she checked it again and noticed that he had driven 12 miles. This information was crucial for the police for two reasons. First, it didn't align with his story about a trip to the store that supposedly took 2.5 hours. Second, they could now estimate the general area where Hughes might have taken Melissa. By subtracting the distance from his home to the complex, they could map out a search area based on the remaining mileage. This led them to an area covering roughly 25 square miles. To cover such a large space, the police enlisted the help of the military, called in helicopters and planes, and even brought in divers to search local bodies of water. Around 400 volunteers also joined the search. Melissa's father, who had flown in from Texas immediately after her disappearance, also took part. The police printed thousands of flyers with information about Melissa's disappearance, hoping to reach as many people as possible. It's worth noting that just 5 months before Melissa went missing, another young girl had disappeared from the same town. Her body was later found, but the police hadn't been able to identify the killer. While the large-scale search was underway, a team of forensic experts were sent to the complex. As we remember, the only potential lead the police had initially found was the open window in the boiler room. The experts examined the area and discovered something interesting. Just outside the window, there was a faint adult-sized boot print, and similar prints led all the way to the parking lot. There were no children's footprints, suggesting that the abductor had likely carried Melissa and placed her in a vehicle. The police had already searched Hughes' car, but hadn't found anything useful. At this point, the FBI got involved. They still didn't have enough evidence to arrest Hughes, so they placed him under 24-hour surveillance. A judge also ordered him to provide a DNA sample in case any new evidence surfaced. As investigators dug into Hughes' background, they uncovered a troubling history. He had multiple arrests dating back to his teenage years. He also had a history of alcohol and substance abuse, and had been suspected several times of inappropriate behavior towards minors. Further investigation revealed that a few years before the incident, Hughes had received a suspended sentence for stealing a car in a neighboring county. When the detectives looked deeper, they found that he had violated his probation, leading the judge to convert his suspended sentence into actual jail time. This gave the investigators a way to put Hughes behind bars, even if it was for a lesser crime. In the following weeks, the search for Melissa continued, but it was fruitless. The terrain made things even more difficult. Most of the area was covered in dense forests with a large river running through it. Then, about 2 months after Melissa's disappearance, something unexpected happened. An unidentified man called Tammy, claiming he had Melissa and demanded a ransom of $75,000. Tammy immediately informed the police, and the FBI agents advised her to gather the money and meet the caller. They quickly set everything up, placing dozens of agents around the area, and began waiting for the supposed kidnapper to show up. Before long, 2 men approached Tammy and the FBI agents swiftly arrested them. It turned out these men had no connection to Melissa's disappearance. They were just two local university students who had seen the news about the missing girl and thought they could make some easy money. Instead, they earned themselves prison sentences. One was sentenced to 7.5 years, and the other received nearly 4 years behind bars. Once again, the investigators found themselves at a dead end. They had a prime suspect, but no solid evidence and no sign of Melissa. In a move to break the case, the detectives decided to re-examine Hughes' car more thoroughly using advanced forensic tools from the FBI. But there was a catch. The car belonged to his wife, so they needed her permission. Fortunately, she immediately agreed, and the forensic team began their work. First, they applied luminol, which revealed traces of blood on the driver's seat mat, pedals, steering wheel, and windshield. This deepened their suspicions of Hughes, but once again, they were unable to extract a usable DNA sample from the blood. Next, the experts decided to search the car for hair, fibers, and other potential clues, but they faced another significant challenge. The car was a mess. The interior was covered in dirt, trash, and dog hair, making it difficult to identify useful evidence amidst the chaos. One of the experts came up with a plan to collect evidence manually using tape. He meticulously went over all the surfaces in the car, then sent the collected materials to the FBI's forensic lab. At first, they found mostly dog hair, which was irrelevant since Hughes and his wife owned 2 large dogs. But then, the forensic experts noticed a different type of hair, dyed black rabbit fur. He soon learned this was the same material used in the coat belonging to Melissa's mother, Tammy. To confirm the match, the experts requested Tammy's coat and verified that the rabbit fur was identical. Investigators theorized that the fur could have transferred to Melissa's clothing when she went to retrieve their coats, or in other situations, as Tammy frequently wore the coat during winter and Melissa was always near her mother. In addition to the fur, the experts found a single light-colored hair that matched strands from Melissa's hairbrush. But the most significant clue was still to come. Numerous small red and blue fibers were found on the car's passenger seat. Since Melissa had been wearing a red and blue sweater and skirt on the night she disappeared, investigators needed to track down those exact clothing items to confirm the connection. They spoke with Melissa's grandmother, who had bought the outfit for her, but she couldn't recall the specific store. The police scoured local shops in an attempt to find matching clothes, but came up empty-handed. The forensic expert kept pondering how to prove the fibrous similarity to Melissa's outfit. One evening, while discussing this dilemma with his wife, she asked him to describe the clothing. After hearing his description, she suggested that the items might have been sold at JCPenney, a major retail chain where she often shopped for their children. She even had a collection of JCPenney catalogs from over the years. She decided to help and began searching through those catalogs, looking for similar clothing. A while later, as she flipped through a Christmas catalog from the previous year, she found what they were looking for. On page 11 was an outfit identical to the one Melissa had been wearing when she disappeared. The breakthrough allowed the investigators to establish a stronger link between Hughes' car and Melissa, as the fiber colors matched the clothes in the catalog. The FBI immediately contacted the company, but they faced another setback. The outfit in question had completely sold out. However, the company offered a potential solution. Since the outfit was sold exclusively through catalogs and only 7,000 sets had been produced, they suggested providing the investigators with a list of all the buyers so the police could track down one of the outfits. The investigators began combing through the list, a task that took quite some time. Eventually, they caught a break. They found a man in Kentucky who had purchased the outfit for his granddaughter but had gotten the size wrong. As a result, the clothes had remained untouched in their original packaging for an entire year. For the investigators, this was the perfect option. The man agreed to send the outfit to the FBI, and the forensic team got to work. This particular model had a unique feature. The manufacturer had created a custom shade of dark blue, coded 887, which was patented and hadn't been used in any other clothing line. After comparing the fibers from this outfit, the experts concluded that they were an exact match to the fibers found in Hughes' car. This provided compelling evidence that one of the 7,000 children who had been bought this outfit had been in his vehicle. Although it didn't definitely prove that Hughes had abducted Melissa, the odds of another child wearing this rare outfit being in his car were astronomically low. As a final step, the expert conducted an additional test. He collected over 100 similar colored fibers from various types of clothing and performed 7,983 tests to compare them with the fibers from Hughes' car. The results showed minimal differences across all the fibers, except for two types. The set from the store and the fibers from Hughes' passenger seat were a 100% match. This eliminated any doubt that someone else wearing similar clothes could have been in Hughes' car. It had to be the exact outfit that Melissa was wearing. Despite this, the detectives still faced a difficult situation. They knew that the fiber evidence, while strong, was circumstantial, even combined with the blood on Hughes' boots, in his car, and other clues they had gathered. But, with nothing else to go on, they decided to formally charge Hughes with Melissa's abduction. The prosecution argued that Melissa was likely dead based on the blood evidence. The fibers from her clothing found on the passenger seat of Hughes' car suggested that he might have forced her to remove her jacket, pointing to a possible motive. According to their theory, Hughes approached Melissa when she went to get the jackets at her mother's request. He then lured her into the boiler room under some pretext, carried her out through the window, and took her to his vehicle. After taking Melissa to an unknown location and presumably killing her, likely with a knife, Hughes disposed of the weapon and hid the body. This would explain his prolonged absence. Following the crime, Hughes attempted to clean the blood from his car and clothing, even going so far as to cut parts of his shoe soles that had been heavily stained. In a final effort, the police decided to conduct a polygraph test, hoping that, combined with all the other evidence, Hughes might finally confess. The state law required either the discovery of the victim's body or the identification of the exact location of the murder to file a murder charge. Since the penalty for kidnapping was significantly less severe, the investigators hoped that Hughes might confess. The polygraph results showed that Hughes provided deceptive answers to almost all key questions, but he still maintained his innocence. With no other options, the detectives had no choice but to proceed with charges of kidnapping. The trial began over 2 years after Melissa disappeared, and Hughes maintained his innocence. His defense attorney tried to challenge the circumstantial evidence, but the prosecution's argument had a much stronger impact on the jury. After 8 hours of deliberation, they found Hughes guilty, and he was sentenced to the maximum penalty, 50 years in prison. Since then, Hughes has remained behind bars, continuing to deny any involvement in Melissa's disappearance. The police made several more attempts to find her body, but none were successful. 4 years after the trial, an energy company worker discovered red fabric fragments in a lake within the search area. Divers were sent to investigate, but they also failed to locate Melissa. 8 years after her disappearance, her mother remarried and raised 4 stepchildren with her new husband. Although she took his surname, she continued to use her previous one everywhere in case Melissa was still alive and trying to find her. As for Hughes, his story didn't end there. On August 2, 2019, he was released early for good behavior, having served just over half of his sentence. At the time of his release, he was 53 years old and has been free for several years now. However, just recently, in September 2024, he was reportedly detained again for a probation violation, and he is expected to serve the remainder of his original sentence. Melissa is still listed as missing since her murder was never proven. However, very few people believe she could still be alive after all these years. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A young couple was planning to attend a friend's birthday party, but they never showed up. Police got involved, and what started as a simple missing persons case quickly turned into one of the most disturbing investigations in recent memory. The details were so haunting, even some of the detectives needed therapy, because nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to uncover. Shannon Christian was born on April 29, 1985, in Texas. When she was 12, her family moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, where she settled in with her parents and older brother. Shannon was the kind of person who made friends instantly. Outgoing, friendly, always ready to help. She fit right into her new school like she'd always been there. People who knew her said she could connect with just about anyone. That warmth and kindness played a big part in her future plans. Shannon wanted to do something meaningful, something that would help others. So, after high school, she enrolled at the University of Tennessee to study sociology. Another reason she chose that school was because she wanted to stay close to home. Shannon was incredibly close to her family, and staying nearby just felt right. But she was also determined to be independent, so she picked up 2 part-time jobs to support herself. While she was at college, she met a guy named Chris Newsom. They hit it off and started dating. At the time, Shannon was 21 and Chris was 23. He worked as a carpenter and, even though he was still young, he had already built a solid reputation for himself around town. On January 6, 2007, Shannon and Chris were planning to go to a friend's birthday party. That afternoon, Shannon went over to her friend's house where Chris was supposed to pick her up a bit later. He was running a little behind, so Shannon's friend ended up heading to the party without her, and Shannon decided to stay at the house and wait for Chris to show up. Before picking up Shannon, Chris had dropped off another friend at the same party and headed straight to get his girlfriend. But, about an hour later, people at the party started to worry. Shannon was only about a 10-minute drive away, but neither she nor Chris had arrived. It just didn't make sense. At first, their friends figured maybe their plans had changed, but something about that didn't sit right. It wasn't like them to just skip out on a close friend's birthday without saying anything. After waiting a while longer, they tried calling both of them, but neither one answered. By the time midnight rolled around, their concern had reached its peak. So, a few of them decided to drive over to the apartment complex where Shannon had been waiting. When they got to the parking lot, they saw Chris' truck, but Shannon's car, the one she had driven earlier, was nowhere to be found. So, their friends assumed the couple had just decided to skip the party without telling anyone, and headed back to celebrate. A bit earlier, Shannon had called her mom and said she'd be home later than expected. She and Chris had decided to spend the evening together, maybe grab something to eat and watch a movie. She told her mom she'd be back around 3:30 in the morning. But that time came and went, and Shannon never showed up. At first, her mom figured she might have stayed the night at a friend's, or maybe at Chris' place, so she didn't panic right away. But the next morning, she got a call that changed everything. Shannon's boss said she hadn't shown up for work. Shannon's mom got in touch with Chris' parents and found out that he hadn't come home the night before either. Neither of them were answering their phones, and now both families were seriously worried. Their friends couldn't reach them either. The whole thing felt off. Sure, Shannon and Chris were adults, but they always kept in touch with their parents. They had never just disappeared overnight without saying anything, and Shannon took her job seriously. There was no way she'd miss a shift without a good reason. Their families started calling every hospital in the area, but no one matching their descriptions had been admitted anywhere, so they turned to the police for help. But the local department refused to open a case, saying that since both Shannon and Chris were adults, the families would have to wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. But Shannon's family wasn't just going to sit around and wait. Her parents reached out to her phone company, hoping that they could help, and surprisingly, they agreed to trace her phone. They said that during the night, Shannon had checked her voicemail 3 times, and that was the last time her phone showed any activity before it turned off. The last signal had pinged off a cell tower near North Cherry Street. That only made her parents more anxious. Knoxville was generally a safe city, but that particular area was known for high crime. It didn't make any sense. Why would Shannon be there? Determined to find answers, her family started searching the neighborhood themselves. After hours of driving around, they finally spotted her car. It was parked just a couple of blocks away from where her phone had last pinged. As soon as Shannon's family got to the car, they knew something was wrong. All of her belongings were missing: photos, her phone charger, everything she normally kept with her. The interior of the car was dirty, which was totally unlike her. Shannon always kept her car spotless. Even more unsettling, the driver's seat had been pushed all the way back, suggesting someone much taller had been behind the wheel. Clearly, Shannon hadn't been the one driving. After this unsettling discovery, her parents called the police again. And this time, officers finally took action. When they arrived at the scene, they noticed something deeply disturbing. The car's interior and door handles had been wiped down, like someone was trying to erase fingerprints. And there was one more thing that didn't sit right: a crumpled, empty pack of cigarettes inside the car. The problem was, neither Shannon nor Chris smoked. All signs pointed to the car possibly being stolen, but investigators still had no clue where Shannon or Chris were. Then, while searching the car, they finally found something that gave them a real lead: an envelope wedged between the seats. It had the address of a house, located right there in the same neighborhood. Even more telling, forensics found a fingerprint on the envelope, and it didn't take long to get a match. The print belonged to a man named Lamarcus Davidson, a convicted felon with a long rap sheet. And, as it turned out, he lived at the very address written on the envelope. Detectives headed straight to the house, but no one was there. Still, they had reason to believe Shannon and Chris might be in immediate danger, and that gave them legal grounds to enter without a warrant. The inside of the house was a mess, but police immediately spotted Shannon's purse, her shoes, and a few other personal items. They also found Chris' baseball cap and his driver's license. But the most horrifying discovery was waiting for them in the kitchen. When one of the officers lifted the lid of the trash can, he found something wrapped in a piece of cloth. Underneath it was a human body. It was Shannon. The case was immediately reclassified as a homicide investigation. Her body was sent to the medical examiner, and detectives were now focused on two urgent questions: where was Chris, and where was Lamarcus Davidson? And they didn't have to wait long for one of those answers. Right after Shannon's body was found, police got word from another department. Nearly 2 days earlier, a railroad employee had discovered the body of an unidentified man near the train tracks. At the time, no one had been able to identify him, but now detectives suspected it might be Chris. And soon, a DNA test confirmed their worst fears. The examination of Shannon and Chris' bodies revealed a truly horrifying picture. They both had numerous injuries, cuts, bruises, and signs of abuse. It was also clear that they both had been sexually assaulted. Chris died from multiple gunshot wounds, while Shannon's cause of death was determined to be suffocation. Forensic experts found biological evidence on Shannon's body that matched Lamarcus Davidson. His fingerprints were also discovered on the trash bags used to wrap her remains. And, if that wasn't enough, investigators also found spent shell casings inside Davidson's house. Those casings matched the bullets that were recovered from Chris' body. With all of this evidence, police had no doubt that Lamarcus was directly involved in the murders, so they focused all their efforts on finding him. Detectives pulled his cell phone records and discovered that over the past couple of days, Lamarcus had been in frequent contact with a man named Eric Boyd. It didn't take long for police to track Eric down. At first, he claimed he didn't know where Lamarcus was. But as soon as investigators explained what Lamarcus was suspected of, and that Eric himself could be charged as an accomplice, he quickly changed his mind and gave up the address. According to Eric, Lamarcus had been hiding out in an empty house that was up for sale. He also admitted that on the very same day Shannon and Chris disappeared, they both had robbed it. Police headed to the house, and sure enough, they found Lamarcus there. He was surrounded by trash and empty food containers, and he had a gun with him. But one detail stood out even more: he was wearing Chris' sneakers. Officers took him in for questioning, and from the very beginning, he denied any involvement. Then, he started changing his story again and again. In total, Lamarcus gave investigators 5 completely different versions of what happened, each one contradicting the last. At first, he claimed he had no idea what anyone was talking about. Then, he said Shannon and Chris had been kidnapped by someone else, and he had nothing to do with it. Later, he told detectives he'd just used the victim's car to drive around and sell drugs. In the end, Lamarcus never confessed, but he did give police a few useful pieces of information. Based on what he said, it was becoming clear that more than one person might have been involved in the murders, and detectives agreed that theory made the most sense. According to Lamarcus, the Rayall killers were his half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, and their mutual friend, George Thomas. Detectives quickly tracked both men down and brought them in for questioning along with Eric, who was now also being treated as an accomplice. None of them were in a hurry to confess, but during the interrogations, police uncovered something interesting. They concluded that all 4 men had likely played some role in the crime, and they weren't alone. There was a 5th person involved, an 18-year-old woman named Vanessa Coleman. Detectives located her and took her into custody as well. With all 5 suspects now under arrest, the questioning continued. Eventually, they all started turning on each other, pointing fingers and telling stories that shifted the blame away from themselves. But even with their conflicting accounts, the growing pile of evidence helped detectives piece together a picture of what really happened that night. Based on everything investigators gathered, Lamaricus seemed to be the ringleader of the group. He was mainly involved in selling drugs, and that night, he planned to steal a car to use for deliveries. He brought along 3 accomplices, plus Vanessa, and they went out looking for the right vehicle. As they were driving through a residential complex, the same one where Shannon was waiting, they spotted her car. She was sitting inside, and Chris was standing next to it. That's when they decided not just to steal the vehicle, but to abduct the couple as well. They forced Shannon and Chris into the car at gunpoint and drove them to Lamaricus' house. According to DNA evidence, both Lamaricus and Latalvis sexually assaulted the victims, and the abuse went on for hours. On top of that, they subjected the couple to other forms of torture and humiliation. By early morning, the attackers led Chris out of the house and took him to the railroad tracks, where they shot him multiple times and left his body there. Then, they returned to the house and continued tormenting Shannon. She remained alive for nearly 2 full days. During that time, her friends and family had already started searching for her, though her car hadn't been found yet. Eventually, they killed her too. Her body was stuffed into a trash can and left inside the house. Investigators also learned that Lamaricus didn't just steal Chris' sneakers. He also took his phone and some of Shannon's personal items, which he later gave to his girlfriend as gifts. As for Vanessa, she insisted that she was a victim too, that she had been at the house against her will. But police found a diary in her home that completely contradicted her story. Vanessa described the day as a wild adventure and wrote that she genuinely enjoyed the experience. In the end, all of the suspects were hit with long lists of charges, and the prosecution began preparing for trial. It took more than 2 years to get everything ready, and during that time, the defense attorneys managed to have the trial moved to a different county. The reason was simple: the case had caused a massive public outcry in Knoxville. People were horrified by what had been done to this young couple, and the defense argued there was no way their clients could get a fair trial in that city. Eventually, the court agreed, and the venue was changed. The first to go on trial was Eric. Throughout the investigation, police were never able to find solid proof that he had directly taken part in the murders, but they did uncover enough evidence to show that he knew what was going on. In the end, he received the maximum sentence for the charges against him, 18 years in prison. Next came the trials of Lamaricus, Latalvis, and George. In a desperate attempt to defend them, their attorney claimed that Shannon and Chris had willingly participated in the horrific abuse they were subjected to. The jury, of course, didn't buy that ridiculous story for a second, and all 3 men were found guilty. Lamaricus was sentenced to death, while Latalvis and George received life in prison. Vanessa's case was a bit more complicated. At first, she had been granted immunity in exchange for testifying against the others. But the court later ruled that her immunity only applied to the carjacking charges, not to the charges related to the murder and sexual assault. So, Vanessa did end up facing trial, and eventually, she was convicted and sentenced to 53 years in prison. In the end, all those responsible were brought to justice. But not long after the verdicts were handed down, the case took a surprising turn. In 2011, the judge who had presided over all 5 trials, Richard Baumgartner, resigned amidst a scandal. It came to light that he had been having an affair with a court employee and had also been buying illegal drugs from criminals. Because of this, a higher court decided to review several of the sentences he had issued, including those of Lamaricus, Vanessa, George, and Latalvis. The news sparked outrage, and understandably so. In the end, prosecutors were able to successfully challenge the decisions involving Lamaricus and Latalvis, meaning their original sentences stood. But the other two, Vanessa and George, were granted new trials. Vanessa was once again found guilty of the same charges, but this time she received a reduced sentence of 35 years instead of 53. George also got a lighter sentence, which made him eligible for parole after serving 51 years. Still, the retrials of Vanessa and George ended up having consequences in the other direction too. During those new proceedings, the prosecution gathered a significant amount of new evidence that suggested Eric had, in fact, taken an active part in the abuse and murders. In 2019, he was hit with new charges. This time, he was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 90 years. Considering that his original sentence was just 18 years, this new ruling all but erased any chance he had of ever being released. Vanessa, on the other hand, became eligible for parole after serving just 7 years. But so far, all of her requests have been denied, and she remains behind bars. In the end, despite all the setbacks, those responsible for the murders of Shannon and Chris were held accountable and received serious prison time, though many still believe every one of them deserved the death penalty. This crime didn't just shake Knoxville, it sent shockwaves across the entire country. People struggled to comprehend how anyone could be capable of something so cruel and inhuman. The house where it all happened was eventually bought by a local company. It was torn down, and in its place, a memorial was built to honor Shannon and Chris. The University of Tennessee also established scholarships in their names, ones that are still active today. And finally, it's worth noting that Lamaricus' death sentence has yet to be carried out. Nearly 20 years after the murders, he's still sitting on death row. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.